On behalf of the UK Baha'i Office of Public Affairs, I wanted to extend a warm welcome to dear colleagues, friends, and ladies and gentlemen who are attending this webinar. I know the pandemic has put many demands on our lives. Therefore, it is more urgent and important, and we are grateful for your presence here at this time. We know that the situation of human rights has progressed in some areas, but in many areas, especially during the past couple of years, it has regressed. Therefore, it is much more important that we are present at these seminars to learn about issues that may not grab the headlines. There are certain issues that may go under the radar. We're grateful to media practitioners who are here, who could do their part and amplify the messages and the solutions that we are going to explore in this gathering. So today we have a lineup of professionals and wonderful speakers here to talk about various areas. Our chair is Mr. Jim Shannon MP. He's the chairperson of the APPG, All-Party Parliamentary Group on International Freedom of Religion and Belief, and a steward, worker, and defender of freedom of religion and belief, who is going to chair the meeting. So without further ado, I pass on the mic to Jim. Thank you, Jim, for being here.
Thank you, Padea, for that introduction, and very pleased. Also nice to see Dan in place and Carmel as well. And I'm presuming that our three speakers are, although I don't see them on the screen, I presume that they're there somewhere. But yeah, I just want to say, first of all, if I could, as the chair of the APPG for Freedom of Religious Belief, that I'm very pleased and honoured to be asked to chair this event today, and pleased to do so. I did have an opportunity this morning and to ask a question to the Foreign Commonwealth Minister on the persecution of ethnic groups, and yesterday or the day before in Parliament I had a chance to ask in relation to Yemen. And I know that Dan, that's one of your countries and where you have a number of people who live there, and particularly Yemen is a difficult place for you. So I just want to let you know that you're certainly not forgotten. You're not forgotten in my prayers, but you're certainly not forgotten when it comes to trying to highlight the issues here in Westminster. Really disappointed in the response from government in relation to the appropriation of the Baha'i lands, and today we wanted to perhaps just get a better understanding of that, and thereby be able to take the next steps which we feel might be helpful. Our first speaker is Max Joseph. He's the Iraq Program Coordinator for Minority Rights Groups International. And prior to this, he has published widely on the political and security challenges affecting minorities in Iraq and Syria and Turkey and Iran as an independent researcher for the past decade. So we're just going to hand over to Max now. And Max, it's over to you. You're in charge at this moment. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jim, for that introduction. So I want to begin by talking about some of the historical precedents which underpin and drive the phenomenon of land theft, specifically within an Iraqi context. Since when discussing minorities, the phenomenon tends to be systematic and at least enabled in part by relevant government authorities. I want to focus on land theft specifically by state and sub-state actors, not non-state actors in this scenario, since it is Western governments like the UK and the US and so on who have the means to create conditionalities around minority rights in the relationships that they maintain with these actors. So land theft is something the vulnerable suffer at the hands of the dominant. And this creates a cycle of violence whereby those who are vulnerable are punished for being vulnerable. and those who represent a dominant demographic or have some kind of influence over government policy, at least, are rewarded for simply being who they are. When we think of something like genocide, the worst crime we can think of is responsible for shaping the demographics of many states in the MENA region. In Iraq, which I'm going to focus on, it created an atmosphere whereby unrecognized indigenous peoples, such as Christian Assyrians, Chaldean Syriacs, and Yazidis, were minoritized. The inflection I use on that word is very deliberate, because the process of becoming a minority, in the sense that, you know, it's lost if you don't describe it in another way. When land theft targets minorities, it existed during even the times of empire. This persisted during the formation of the nation states that we know today. And when we talk about minorities such as I mentioned, Christians and Yazidis, Yazidis were not only confined to Shinjar, as we know they are now. They had many villages across Nineveh and Dohuk provinces, but they were all destroyed in the 19th century. And they were never reclaimed or rebuilt again. Christian Assyrians were not only clustered around Nineveh, where the Pope is visiting at the end of the week, but formed large communities all around the country, especially in the north. Their villages faced the same fate throughout the 20th century. Now, we see this in acts such as the still unrecognized massacre of as many as 6,000 unarmed Assyrian men, women, and children in Semele, Dohuk province, by the newly independent state of Iraq in 1933. Britain at the time honored the Anglo-Iraqi treaty they had signed in 1930 before it bequeathed the country to the Hashemite family, and actually supplied the Iraqi army with ammunition during this campaign, despite the fact that Assyrians at the time were British allies themselves and survivors of a recent genocide, and represented the largest cohorts among the Iraqi levies enlisted by Britain, including one of them was my grandfather, who served out of RAF Habaniya outside Baghdad. To this day, many of the dead lie in unmarked and forgotten graves in their ancestral villages, but these villages and their lands have now been taken. Now, seismic events like this shape the future of some countries, even more so when there is no justice or legal framework to deliver in the years that follow. It's not without reason to suggest that had this massacre and others like it had not taken place, the demographics of Iraq would be very different. Various regimes which came to power may have been very different, along with the legal protections afforded to minorities in the country. I say this because the policy of Arabization, which was well documented through the Ba'ath years, came afterwards, was a complete nightmare for minorities in Iraq. While all groups suffered under the tyranny of Saddam, the plight of minorities was existential in nature, and it remains so in a liberated Iraq. And again, as I said, various groups have suffered in this liberated Iraq, whether they be Shia Arabs at the hands of Islamist gangs and Ba'ath loyalists, whether they be Sunni Arabs at the hands of Shia gangs and in Baghdad and further up north in their villages. But it is the minorities who face unique challenges, given their already precarious position in the country, absent any international support, absent international sponsors, or any political will that will put their needs on par of the more dominant groups. Now, I wanted to quickly provide that historical context with regards to Iraq before I launch into the mechanisms and consequences of land theft, which targets minorities. And I'm going to break this up by discussing two different phenomena that are linked, but they help inform understanding about each, which is land theft in an urban context and land theft in a rural context, which is the subject of most of what I'm going to say. Now, to begin about land theft in an urban context, it's important to highlight that land theft in this context has affected minorities in Iraq almost just as severely as land theft in the rural one. And I want to say, I want to bring up a very incredible fact, and again, it's something that went very unreported, especially in the years prior to ISIS and in the years following. That is, in 2018, Christian MPs submitted legislation in Baghdad which sought to return more than 57,000 properties, just in Baghdad alone, to their rightful owners. These properties were seized and stolen by gangs and their political sponsors in the chaos and lawlessness after 2003. Now, quoting one of the MPs, quote, "The number of properties that were converted without legal support between 2006 and 2010, just in Baghdad, amounted to more than 23,000 residential homes. What Christians, including Assyrians, Chaldeans, Syriacs, have lost in Baghdad seems irreversible. They have been almost purged from the country's capital, much like Jews were decades prior. And Jews at one point represented 25% of Baghdad's population in the 40s. But who would know that today? An official from the Department of Housing within the government, speaking on the condition of anonymity, confirmed that the file, i.e. of Christian properties, is one of the most dangerous files in the department, and a dangerous mafia oversees it, close quote. Having seen these requests rejected in 2018, petitioning MPs were informed that, quote, "A new parliament is not responsible for the crises and problems that have not been dealt with by the previous parliaments, and the issue of Christian property has not been dealt with during the previous parliamentary sessions," close quote. An Iraqi legal expert, I won't name on this issue for obvious reasons, said, "There is no law that requires Parliament to open files that were signed during the previous Parliament. So Christians will not be able to pass such a law, especially since the militias and the parties that have stolen their properties control a large number of seats in Parliament." Now, this reality typifies Christian Syrians and their second or third class citizenship in the country at present. They have no rights regarding property, neither in the north or the south, and I'll get to the north imminently. There is no legal recourse to reclaim these things, and if there were, there is no will to enforce justice if that justice benefits them. Now, moving on to a rural context, which is the ongoing phenomenon right now. Land theft in this context is happening overwhelmingly in the north of the country, the breadbasket of the country where a lot of farms are located, which falls under jurisdiction of the Kurdistan regional government. These farming communities form the major part of minority life now in Iraq, having already fled to the city from the cities. It's important to mention land theft in an urban context, as I just did, because many of those who find themselves forced out of Baghdad, Mosul, Kirkuk, and Basra and the major cities end up going back to their ancestral villages where they still own property, whether directly or through family. The well-documented and rather crudely labeled phenomenon of brain drain was talked about in the years following 2003, given the flight of well-educated, wealthy members of minority communities who had lived in their home cities for generations. But it's often those who live in rural communities and villages who do not have the means to leave terrible situations, unless absolutely forced to as refugees under duress and violence. Here, the act of land theft is more gradual and insidious. It is an acre or two here and there, or part of an orchard, year by year. There are illegal constructions of homes on property belonging to minorities such as Christians and Yazidis, encroachments by majority group farmers, fences are ignored and built over. The offending parties simply do not fear the law, since whatever court verdict is given in any land dispute is ultimately not enforced if it is in favor of the minority communities. If we are talking about the Kurdistan region of Iraq, the KRI, this creates a very slow form of ethnic cleansing, where Kurdish farmers slowly end up squeezing out Assyrians, Yazidis, and other minorities. Of course, minorities are not the only ones affected by this phenomenon. Kurds can be victims, Arabs can be victims here too. The difference is, for, I guess, lack of a better words, while the crime of land theft involving, for example, one Kurd against another is a terrible crime that should be punished to the full extent of the law, but is a crime that once done, it does not change the ethnic, linguistic, or religious character of a region in the same way as the same crime affects victims of minority backgrounds. This phenomenon has existed within the KRI for decades. Now, to list some examples that are ongoing in cases that are still open and ignored. About 750 acres of land located between the villages of Bersaba and Nafkandala and Dohuk province has been stolen since 1993 under the KRI. The KRG Ministry of Tourism would simply write new deeds for these lands, and the owners, without the owners' knowledge, would suddenly wake up and see tractors and other building materials just turn up on their lands. In Sarsink and Diana, two areas which were fully populated by Christian Assyrians in my own lifetime, are now almost fully Kurdish due to the population movements and the political will supporting them. These have become so extreme that Diana itself has been renamed Soran, which is another feature of this phenomenon of, previously it was Arabization, and now we're talking about Kurdification in the north. In the Nala Valley in Erbil, there were 42 cases of land theft alone in recent years. Here, the court actually ruled in favors of the minorities. So the minorities went to court and they heard the case, and the courts ruled in their favor. But as we've seen, the encroaching farmers just simply resumed their activities free of any consequence, such as building barns or grazing their livestock the following years. Nothing happened. In the village of Rabatka in 2013, after filing multiple complaints with the authorities to no avail, the mayor of the village confronted a Kurdish Peshmerga lieutenant who had seized land belonging to Assyrians in the town and started constructing a house on it. The lieutenant struck the mayor with his pistol and asserted that the land was his. In Ankawa, which is the main Christian enclave in Erbil, one of the last remaining in the KRI, the international airport that you would land when you go into Erbil was constructed on land expropriated from Christian families by the ruling Kurdistan Democratic Party. According to the testimony of the families, they were told to sell their land for 1/10 of their value, or it would be taken by force anyway. Today, if anyone finds themselves landing in Erbil, the first thing they will see is a huge invisible cross installed by the KDP in an effort to reassure visitors of the KRI's tolerance and diversity of religious minorities. The families who once owned that land are now in diaspora. There have been many protests around this too, such as the ones in 2016, but many of these are blocked by governing authorities and therefore attract little media attention. Much of recent attention is shaped around the framework of religious minorities, and therefore it's common to seek guidance on these issues from religious authorities, i.e. archbishops, church leaders, and so on. While they will provide incredible insight into the plight of minorities in the context of religious freedom, it's difficult to fully chart the extent of abuses without a more careful analysis and using a wider framework. I say this because it's not enough that one church is maintained and celebrated, or two churches or three churches, which is something often held up by various governments as a sign of their own tolerance. As you can see now, the Pope's visit, there's a big, it's almost like a party in Iraq. Everyone's excited about this visit, and they're putting up signs and posters of the Pope and so on. But where was this, where was any of this in the years previous to this visit? Because the people still are suffering these conditions. There needs to be, alongside these churches that are maintained and respected, there needs to be hundreds, if not thousands, of homes around them for the communities themselves who can live safely and prosper on an equal footing within mainstream society. Now, one of the most pressing issues today for me as a researcher documenting the plight of minorities in Iraq is around the still so-called disputed territories where many of the minorities still live and which Daesh, ISIS assaulted in the Nineveh Plains in Iraq. Now, these towns have, been decimated, but there has been various variable rates of return among them. The reason why I bring this up is because in one town in particular, a town called Al-Ghush, which has received some media attention in recent years, is a town that's fully populated by Christians and has been since forever, really. This particular town is currently under the security protection of the KRG's Peshmerga. Now, this town lies outside of the KRI, but its security is the Peshmerga, And that remains the situation today, much to the angst and the population basically have protested numerous times about this. So I just want to talk about this town briefly before I go into some conclusions. It's probably the most pronounced and audacious attempt by a governing authority to annex territory and enact demographic change in Iraq right now, is this locus of Al-Qush. Militias belonging to the KDP reoccupied the town after they had fled in 2014, because that's what happened. Whereas Iraqi army forces fled Mosul, most of the surrounding territories around the Nineveh Plain was secured by Kurdish Peshmerga, who also fled north. So yeah, the Iraqi forces fleeing south and Kurdish Peshmerga forces fleeing north, leaving the minorities there with no security. Now, after the territorial defeat of ISIS, these forces have re-emerged and returned to their previous stations. Now, after 2014, Al-Qush had a mayor that was deposed by the Kurdistan Democratic Party. And what happened after that was he was detained, tortured, and beaten, and threatened to not return to office. And then the KDP installed their own mayor into the town, an individual named Lara Yusuf. I bring this up because during the Kurdistan referendum on independence, Al-Qush was forced to vote in it, despite being outside of the KRI, due to these governing mechanisms that were put in place by the ruling party. Now, Al-Qush has a population of about 3,000. 700 people turned out to vote, and they vote almost unanimously no in that referendum. Yet the town returned votes amounting to 4,000 for yes. Now, this is important because as part of the annexation efforts by the KRG towards these territories in the Nineveh Plain, with that annexation comes demographic change, comes land theft, comes expropriation of properties. This is why it's very important. Al-Qush residents cannot even participate in the security of their own town because of the Kurdish Peshmerga unless they join the political party that sponsors them. To this day, the KRG officials have no answer to the question as to why the KRG claimed this town and others around it, despite no Kurds actually living there, which is, I think, baffling for me. It's a question that I encourage everyone to keep asking. Now, I want to conclude anyway. I went on a tangent there, but I want to conclude by presenting two challenges, I think, for us going forward with regards to minorities, land rights, and the legal dynamics. Firstly, as I said, there's obviously a legal challenge. This can cover cases where a judge decides outcomes based on evidence presented, as well as maybe the trickier conceptual stuff around constitutional law, which should create a framework for more long-term progress for minorities inside states which currently discriminate against them. Now, both aspects present unique challenges in any country. What needs to be addressed here is how we can progress in either aspect. How can progress be made? How can we begin to create pathways for legislation to be passed, but also enforced? As we've seen in the KRI, this makes no difference if verdicts are given in favor of minorities. The goal here is never to just, achieve or arrive at pieces of paper. There needs to be lasting change on a governance level, but also a societal one. I've always believed that demonstrating the value of minority communities somewhere is the case to enhance their lot everywhere else. I think the second challenge here is one related to documentation. In the absence of conditions amenable for minorities to feel safe and prosper, how can we at least document what is being lost in a careful way to provide some kind of substance to the memories of those who are dispossessed, destitute, or in diaspora? I've learned that this second challenge is one that hangs over us every day as individuals working on these issues. Perhaps with a personal motivation on my own part, as I described at the beginning. But my own grandparents survived genocide shortly after the First World War, and what remained of the Ottoman Empire, and were forced to maneuver through new states and societies which had already rejected them. What they and their kin believed was that what is lost can one day be retrieved. They simply had to believe this. Nothing is out of the realms of possibility in this sense. despite how remote that prospect of justice feels right now. There is no excuse to abandon any pursuit of justice, as we've learned, since crimes as terrible as land theft are intergenerational. And so it follows that the pursuit of justice to correct them must be too. We know this in the context of Iraq, through the Ba'ath years, through the Kurdish uprising, through the Iran-Iraq war. Christian Assyrians, Yazidis, and other minorities were forced out of the country. One heroic individual that I know compiled an extremely long list of land theft abuses, meticulously, like village by village, down to individuals and families and so on, using a pseudonym, and published it in Arabic during the later years of Saddam. Assyrians in diaspora today look at documents like this and remember their villages, the villages their own parents and grandparents came from, which are now either Arabized or Kurdified and so on, with no recourse to reparation or justice. This inspires them to care about justice not only in their context, but serves to create empathy between those who have suffered similar. We, representing Western states who build and maintain relationships with these states in question today, must do more to consider provisions to protect the rights of minorities in a very meaningful way, especially those related to land, since land offers them the space to be who they are. This is where courage and leadership come into play, because while minorities may not provide the most compelling value proposition in any policy that is written or authored in the West, the status quo has failed not only them, but everyone else. I want to quote my friend here to end. He was antagonized recently by a polling official when he tried to vote in the Iraqi elections, the most recent ones anyway. He responded to the polling official, quote, "You enforce the laws that hurt us, but not the laws that protect us," close quote. That captures the atmosphere that needs changing fast, because these communities in Iraq, in Iran, in Turkey, in Syria, and so on, elsewhere in the region, will disappear into diaspora if inaction continues. Thanks. That concludes.
Pablo Vargas, he works for Pulso 18, a Christian advocacy organization that works in Mexico in partnership with Christian Solidarity Worldwide, an organization which we're all very aware of. He's an expert on the situation for religious minority groups in Mexico, highlighting cases in Guerrero and Hidalgo. I'm very pleased to have you here, Pablo. Apologies for that interruption. We look forward very much to hearing what you've got to say. Thank you so much. Thank you.
No, I'm grateful for the invitation and your interest and how it's going in my country. Yeah, like my introduction said, like CSW was a human rights organization with more than 40 years of experience advocating for the right to freedom of religion of belief. We work in over 26 countries worldwide, and I have been working in Mexico for around 8 years. The background of Mexico is a multicultural nation. It has a rich cultural and religious heritage. It has caused faith to be deeply rooted in the population. According to the 2020 census, 77.7% of the population identified as Catholic, 11.2% as Protestant or Evangelic, 80.1% non-religious or atheist, 2.5% without any religious affiliation, and 0.2% in other religions. Despite this, Mexico has a historically complicated relationship with the religion. Both Roman Catholic and Protestant have suffered severe persecution over the course of the country's history. Many citizens participate in religious activities on a regular basis without any hindrance, and significant percent, however, is subject to moderate and severe violation of their freedom of belief. The history of Mexico as a nation started in the year 1347, when a group of nomads from North America who were searching for a place to establish themselves settled in the present-day Valley of Mexico. The Aztec Empire, also known as the Mexica, prevailed above the rest of the rule of the territory nearly for around 200 years. Since then, land has been divided into calpullis or states, some of which were used to sustain the Tlatoani, the king, and the other areas which were for the general population. Every citizen was under the rule of some nobleman, but will not belong to him personally. He will simply manage the use of the land. Through the conquest, the land passed to the Spanish crown in 1521, who in turn be means in a royal grants establish private property. But public property also exists for the use of the government administration and the wider public. From 1821, with the Mexican independence, a process began involving of confiscation of properties belonging to the Spanish at the church, which became law in the year 1657. Despite aim of this line being to redistribute land to those who rented, owned, or worked. The lack of education and the corruption did not allow for a just redistribution. This in the year 1910, one of the principal driving forces of the Mexican Revolution was disparate distribution and land grabbing. The revolution culminated in 1916 with the enactment of a new constitution, which in the Article 27 recognized the right of people who work the land to be its owners. And a program started to break up areas of land that have been monopolized with a smaller group of people in the past decades. In the same constitution, the word ejido, in other words, common land, was officially mentioned. This recognized the rights of each community to have sufficient land for their organization and communal sustainment. The common land, or ejido, could not be sold. Rarely, it could only pass down to a child or a spouse. That is to say, it was not considered like a private property. In the year 1992, after reforms to the Constitution and this agrarian law, a system was established to allow for and required the consent to the community to change communal property or common law into private property. That means that it could be sold. The use and customs, currently a problem has arisen in the interpretation of these laws, as communal rights are mixed with the uses and customs of indigenous communities. These uses and customs that have long been a part of Mexican story gained constitutional recognition in the year 1994 and is enriched in Article 2. This constitution recognizes and protects the indigenous people right to self-determination and consequently the right to autonomy, so that they can decide their turn and form of coexistence, as well their social, economic, political, and cultural organization, apply their own legal system to regulate and solve their internal conflicts, subjected to the general principle of this constitution, respecting individual guarantees and human rights. In the Article 24 of the Mexican Constitution maintains that everyone is free to embrace the religion of their choice and to practice all ceremonies, devotion, or observance of their respective faith, either in place of public worship or at home, provided do not constitute an offense punishable by law. In other words, freedom of religion of belief is guaranteed for all the citizens. Despite this protection, the use and custom has degraded the human rights of individuals and have superimposed community decision over the human dignity, giving prevalence to agreements that are made inherent with community leaders about civil law and the Constitution itself. In practice, they are constitute a judge and party and agreements that should only be procedural or administrative. The result of this is in criminal sanction, fines, expulsions from the community, and appropriation of community lands. CSW has documented cases among indigenous communities in many states of Mexico, where religious majorities have treated religious minorities with the loss of their ejido, their property rights, if they do not participate economically and actively in the community religious activities. In the state of Hidalgo, for example, in the community of Pamontax, a family was expelled from their community on the 28th July 2019. Their home has looted and destroyed, and their ejido property rights were taken away because they belong to a religion which is not the majority. In August 2020, the community leaders harvested the pepper that this family have of their land, showing that they are not longer recognized as members of the community. Today, almost 2 years later, they are not even allowed to enter the community. For forcibly displaced families such as this, few options are available for them. Barred from working their land, they are often left with alternatives to earn an income. It's practically impossible to become part of another ejido or community unless the government intervenes in some way. Similarly, in the community of El Mesón Zapote in the state of Guerrero, in the 12th November 2020, 12 families were no longer recognized as members of the community, and their ejido property rights were retried because they have refused to participate in religious activities and in a build a church of the majority religion. As a way exerting pressure of them and a sign that they are no longer recognized as members of the community, on 1st of January 2021, a member of the religious minority group died, and community leaders prevent the family from burying him in the community. In the same way, government social programs that include subsidies for the rural sector and agriculture are distributed through local community authorities, which has meant that those who do not profess the majority religion of the community have often been denied and restrict access to such benefits. The agrarian law in Mexico, an ejido property was a right that achieved in this time a restitution and recognition of the work of the peasant farmers over the landowners and latifundios, that is means large land estates, but now this right is restricted or over-terminated to the religious belief professed by the holder of these rights. This situation persists. In several states in my country, these conflicts have not received real attention from the government. On the one hand, to know the government decides to downplay or deny the issue in political discourse, and on the other hand, due to a lack of understanding and training of human rights of the actors and officials whose responsibility is to intervene to resolve this case. This has created a culture of impunity and a social backwardness for those who suffer in this way specifically. Interestingly, in 2020, the National Supreme Court of Justice declared unconstitutional the expulsion of a group of Jehovah's Witnesses who have been expelled from their community in the state of Jalisco, to not belong to a religious minority and not to believe of the majority. The Supreme Court reintegrate and protect of this group. This ruling set an important precedent for freedom of religion, of belief, and human rights in Mexico. Nevertheless, there is still a long way to go to respect the ejido property rights of a communal land and of religious minority groups in communities that are governed by use and customs. But even having the opportunity to speak about this in this forum opened the possibility of a new perspective and search to safeguard this right. And thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much for that, Pablo. And it's quite disturbing to hear what's happening there. And I think as others have recognized on the screen, that not only is it the denial of land rights, it's also denied the burial rights, and that is quite worrying. We really do have some concerns. So thank you for that. Our third speaker, and we're very pleased and honoured, privileged indeed to have Stephen Powles to speak. He's a QC, he's a barrister at Doughty Street Chambers, where he heads and leads the international team. He's a specialist in international crime and extradition and human rights. With all a particular interest in human rights. He is currently based in the Seychelles, where he is prosecuting money laundering and corruption cases. Wow. He is also a member of the Baha'i community. So we're very pleased, Stephen, to have you on the screen. We look all very much forward to hearing your contribution. And you're a man of many talents. Over to you. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, Jim, for your very kind introduction and for all the work that you and the All Parliamentary Group do to promote freedom of religious belief worldwide. And a thank you to Paddy there for the kind welcome, and to Pablo and Max for your informative but troubling presentations. And a sincere thanks to all who have taken the time to attend today, and a very warm welcome to you from my home to yours. In these days of pandemic and lockdown, many of us have been confined to our homes, perhaps more than we would care. But it has maybe also given us each an opportunity to reflect upon and consider how blessed we are to have a space in which to live, to call home, and for now, for many of us, a place from which to work. Our homes give us that vital space and a physical structure which now not only protects us from the elements, but also gives us some protection from a potentially deadly virus. And it is that simple protection that a home gives, which when denied on discriminatory grounds, can be all the more devastating. With everything that's going on in the world at the moment, with massive human rights abuses being committed against the Rohingya in Myanmar, the Uyghur in China, compared to the extraordinary brutality of groups like ISIS committed against minorities like the Yazidis and others, against that backdrop, perhaps the deprivation of land rights in Iran maybe does not seem so extreme. But to me, the subject of the persecution of the Baha'is in Ivel is very personal. My mother and her family are Baha'is and come from Iran. And for me, as an impressionable teenager, growing up in London in the 80s, I regularly heard of the injustices that the Baha'i community had to endure in Iran after the revolution in 1979. I heard of a cousin detained by morality police because her tights were deemed too thin, and then as a punishment permanently disfigured. I heard of the arrest and torture of a 17-year-old Mona Mahmoudnejad, her only crime being her faith and her steadfast refusal to recant. I heard that in June 1983, she, together with 9 Baha'i women in Shiraz, were taken and hung, one after the other. It was chilling news like that that in part drove and inspired me to become a human rights lawyer. But those stories from Iran were not unique one-offs. They were part of a systematic campaign of persecution by the Iranian authorities. Iran's 300,000 Baha'is are the country's largest non-Muslim religious minority. More than 200 Baha'is have been executed in the years since the revolution in '79. In 1996, a 1991 policy document called The Baha'i Question, signed by Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, came to light. It called for the progress and development of Iran's Baha'i community to be blocked and for Baha'is to be denied education and livelihoods. Thousands of articles of propaganda against the Baha'is were published in Iran's state media each year. And in addition, hundreds of Baha'i-owned properties, including homes, small businesses and farms, were confiscated since the revolution. And the persecution of the Baha'is in Ivel is very much a part of that massive campaign. The Baha'i community in the village of Ivel in northern Iran was founded about 150 years ago. Baha'is make up about half of Ivel's population. They have lived, for the most part, side by side with their Muslim neighbors in harmony. The majority of them are hard-working farmers who earn their living and subsistence solely from the land that has belonged to their families for generations. They have always been committed to social, economic, and cultural development, helping to build schools, medical facilities, and bathhouses, assisting fellow citizens in the aftermath of earthquakes, and helping with the care of war victims. But they have, in return, been under constant attack. In 1983, Baha'is in Ivel were expelled from their homes and barred from returning. 130 of them, including women, children, and the elderly, were locked into a mosque for 3 days without food or water. In 2010, 50 Baha'i homes were burned and destroyed, literally razed to the ground with the help of bulldozers and tractors. This was clearly part of a planned and systematic operation. In August 2020, a special court to rule on issues under Iran's constitution issued a final and binding order determining the ownership of the lands belonging to the Baha'is of Ivel to be illegal. The court decision was made without any procedural guarantees, without lawyers being granted access to prepare a defence or gain access to documents in the case. Thereafter, in October of 2020, the Court of Appeal in Mazandaran rejected the appeal of 27 Baha'is and confirmed that their land should be confiscated, ruling against the legacy of, they ruled against the legitimacy of the ownership of the land by Baha'is. This appears to be the final step in the actions of the Iranian authorities to illegally dispossess Baha'is of the ownership of their homes and land in Ivel. The basis, or rather the lack of it, is seen to some extent in Article 13 of the Constitution of Iran, which provides Zoroastrian, Jewish and Christian Iranians are considered to be the only recognized religious minorities in Iran. As such, the Baha'i community are specifically denied the status of religious minority, and as a result are judged to be unprotected infidels in state policy and in the law. This is how the courts in Iran have justified taking Baha'i property. Because Baha'is are not recognized, they are not, as a result, permitted to be the lawful owners of property. These decisions in Iran appear to have closed off any further opportunity for the Baha'is of Ivel to defend their rights and regain their land. The Baha'is now therefore look to the international community for assistance. Of course, the action of the Iranian authorities is contrary to human rights law, contrary to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which prohibits discrimination on religious grounds, which guarantees the right to property and not to be arbitrarily denied property, and guarantees the freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Similar guarantees, although not identical, are contained in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which Iran ratified under the Shah in June 1975, but which the current regime has declared null and void. So international human rights standards are and will be very difficult to apply and enforce in Iran. The international community and civil society can, of course, lobby and put pressure on their own respective governments to put pressure on the Iranian government to comply. But sadly, Iran doesn't seem very interested or concerned about how it is perceived internationally. Iran does not, sadly, seem receptive to outside influence. It is very difficult, it seems, to persuade them to look at things from a different perspective or angle. But that doesn't mean, in my view, that continuous pressure on Iran is redundant. It serves as a reminder, an important reminder, to the Iranian regime that their injustices are scrutinized and are not going unnoticed. And so, of course, Baha'is are very grateful for all the very many messages of support that the Baha'is of Ivel have received from around the world, the UK, Canada, and Germany, to name but a few. But perhaps the most significant support comes from Islamic leaders around the world. Why? It's because it exposes the lie of the Islamic regime in Iran that their discrimination against the Baha'is is somehow justified. The American Islamic Congress, the Canadian Council of Imams, and Sheikh Ibrahim Mogra, one of the leading Islamic scholars in the United Kingdom, and many more, have all issued statements in support of the Baha'is in Ivel, expressing grave concern about the confiscation of the properties. The Canadian Council of Imams have written, "We are deeply concerned by the ruling issued by the Iranian court to confiscate the properties of 27 Baha'is in the farming village of Ivel." And Sheikh Ibrahim Mogra specifically called upon Iran's Chief Justice, Ebrahim Raisi, to address this injustice, and added that Islam does not permit a government to confiscate lands from citizens just because they follow a different religion. Whether this action will move the Iranian regime to change its approach, who knows? But the regime should not assume that they can and will be able to continue mistreating the Baha'is and other minorities with impunity. If history teaches us anything, it is that situations can and do change. At the height of his power, I dare say Pinochet never dreamed that he could be one day arrested on torture charges in London. I dare say Milosevic no doubt never thought that he'd end up before a UN International Criminal Tribunal in The Hague. And as Max so forcefully said earlier, what is lost can one day be retrieved. I, for one, hope that the situation in Iran will change very soon to allow Baha'is of Iran the freedom to which they are entitled, to give them an equal place in Iranian society, and allow them to make the rich and positive contribution to their country and to their fellow Iranians that we all know they can. If the Iranian regime allows that, it may in turn help them to be seen as a more positive way in the international community and allow Iran perhaps with its rich culture and history to maybe even one day be seen as a positive force on the world stage. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed for that. It was incredible, and it gives us an idea what needs to be done legally as well. Those last thoughts that you give there, Stephen, I think would indicate perhaps maybe there may be another way. I think it's important that some of the imams, Muslim imams, have taken that very, very positive step to say those things, and we'll see where that goes. Padea or Dan, do you want to come in perhaps?
Thank you, Jim. Well, I mean, you're chairing the meeting. I think we'll just open the floor to questions if people have questions,
okay,
so we can unpack many issues that were mentioned here. Okay,
if you want to ask a question, just please indicate in the screen or your name if I don't see you at this moment in time. Okay, thank you. Anyone want to?
So while people are waiting, I'll just ask a question because it was mentioned here. I think Max in his presentation mentioned the issue of documentation, which the Baha'i community finds an important factor to enable lawmakers to be able to safeguard human rights of the minorities. And my question in particular is that how we could empower or what mechanisms are there to assist the minorities to contribute to that, to this process. And you've mentioned the example of some of the villages, Al-Ghosh. Are there sort of the minorities there, do they have the ability, the means to collect those data, and how we could actually highlight this process as a mechanism?
Yeah.
Max, thank you.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it's a great question because it's something that, for example, if I'm speaking to younger Christians from Iraq and diaspora, they ask me about the issues in Iraq, they ask me what's going on, they ask me how can we make things better. One of the questions that I ask them in return before giving them my own take on it is how often do they actually speak to Christians in Iraq? Do they have relationships with them? Are they nurturing connections? So we do exist in diaspora, but that doesn't mean we're severed from the country completely. And in those relationships that we can foster with them, there's going to be transmission of skills and knowledge and information sharing. And that isn't an overnight process. It takes a lot of time, a lot of trust, especially trust. And as I said, the way I look at it is when I'm gathering information and doing research, I'm not picking up the phone to just get something and put it down. So I'm developing a relationship all the time with people there. And I think if we're talking about within one community itself, in a professional context or not, those connections are invaluable on a professional level to actually develop a database of all of this, of these abuses, but also I think on a personal level too, because one of the problems that we have in diaspora is that there's this feeling of rootlessness, or that we don't belong here, we don't belong there, so on, and engaging and fostering these relationships really does help kind of alleviate that feeling, which is suffered by a lot of youth in diaspora who have been victims, you know, of their families having to flee, or, you know, and so on. And the information that I've gathered, you know, around Alpush specifically, as you mentioned, is by residents in Alpush themselves, you know, developing techniques that can consist of, you know, encrypted messages and phone calls, things are not recorded so much, and things like that. Sometimes it has to be that way, unfortunately, because of the governing authorities. So yeah, I mean, it's a multifaceted approach to this documentation, but I think they're all of these facets are equally important as each other.
Pablo or Stephen, do you want to add to that, please? No? Okay. Anyone else who has any questions, please indicate, please.
I think there's a question from Wendy Moen of the National Association of Women's Organisations. I don't know, Wendy, if you're able to ask that.
Oh, if she's not there, Dan, if you know the question, maybe you can ask it if she's not there. Okay.
I am here.
Yeah, Wendy, thank you.
Thanks, Dan. It's the National Alliance of Women's Organisations. And just for those who might not know, we're based in England, but we cover the whole of the UK. And we also have relationships with the Government Equalities Office, and of course, coming up to the Commission on the Status of Women in New York, but virtually this year. And, you know, we're one of those organizations that does campaigning and brings it, matters like this to the attention of the public. And in these cases, it was just wondering, you know, how can individuals or their organizations help to bring these to the attention of a wider number of people, and also what's the appropriate way to do that so that the I don't really know exactly how to frame this, but you know, so that the people themselves who are living in those situations are not diminished by that activity. In other words, that they're not seen as some kind of helpless victim, but as people who are themselves powerful and can be innate, but need to be released from the constraints of their power, if I can put it, the powers they have. Hope that helps.
Stephen, would that be one for you, perhaps? Okay, thank you.
Yes. Well, I mean, in terms of raising greater awareness, obviously there's the media, and in particular social media, which is, for all its ills, can be an incredibly powerful tool that can reach right into the heart of a country like Iran and raise greater awareness as to the plight of Iran's Baha'i community. Particularly if fellow Iranians can see the Baha'is and see that they look and are very much like them and are similar people to them, and see their plight and hear their plight, of course that engenders a greater desire to reach out and help their fellow citizens. Around the world, of course, there's the power of reaching out to other human rights groups and smaller minorities to working together, especially where they have common problems and common issues around the world. In that unity, there can be a louder voice that can push the problems and injustices that those various communities suffer to the greater fore. And finally, in relation to your point about ensuring that people are not diminished, in my humble experience, the victims of human rights abuses, far from diminishing them when the world and the wider community gets to hear about the abuses that they've suffered, it can actually have the opposite effect. It can empower them. For the world to see that, notwithstanding the abuses that they have suffered, they are still standing, still proud, and still have a voice, I think can be really empowering. And I think that's why, and I guess is at the heart of your question, why there's an even greater need for those in the privileged position that we are in, to be able to raise their plight, to use that power and to use that opportunity to empower them and to give them a voice in these difficult times.
Thank you for that, Stephen. Max or Pablo, some experiences perhaps, if you want to give an answer.
Yeah, I think an experience of CSW, we can see like we have to work in two different ways. We have to work like in the land with the people to understand better what is the needs, but at the same time we have to work like in the high levels, because like my presentation say, one of the big problems here in Mexico is that the government don't recognize like the problem, and actually the victims don't recognize the same situation. Like we have, for example, one case in Guerrero, and they pay like a special tax for being a Christian during 30 years, and they don't recognize that they have a problem until they increase, the special taxes for these communities. And so, and they say, I think that something is wrong here. And so I think that when we train in and we make like make a better understanding to the people, like what is means this issue, and when it's applied, like when you protect the right of freedom of religion to others, you protect yourself, your own freedom of religious belief. And actually, it's other like situation that CSW recognized in this situation is like when we have like this violation or these like problems about the freedom of religion, is like a highlight, like something is wrong. It's not just about the freedom of religion, like we talk about in this like webinar, like the freedom of religion of belief is like the sign that something is wrong, because it's applied to all the social. And now when we talk about like how the people like bring the land to others, because they take this pretext of the freedom of belief, freedom of religion of belief. And so I mean, like in the answer of this question, I think that we have to like encourage this respect for this right in all the areas of the communities. I mean, here in Mexico, it's not just a problem of the Christian, it's a problem of the minorities. And so, and I mean that it's a problem of how I feel respect somebody that it's less than me, or how I believe that this person, because he believes something different of me, he's less than me. I mean, like this is something that we have to keep growing and to give a better understanding about like how we can handle this and how is the successful of the unity and the faith. And so, yeah, this is my opinion. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks very much. Max, if you wish to come in.
Yeah, just very briefly, I'll just say that whenever I'm dealing with community organizations regarding, so we're talking about Christian or Syrian or Yazidi, what they want when they're forming relationships with other organizations is partnership, not to be spoken to and told what they need and want. They need to be present on an equal footing. And I see this a lot, especially in communities in the US, where there's many American organizations who believe that they know what's best, especially concerning various minorities. And when minority communities tell them, actually, these are the problems or these might be the solutions, they're not listened to because they believe that they don't know any better, or we know best, and so on. And this mirrors the problem that they have in their home countries, because in those countries, their relationships with governing authorities, with dominant groups, are vertical relationships. These minorities want horizontal relationships where they believe that they feel that they are equals. And that is one thing that we can easily do this in diaspora and in the West and so on and so forth. But yeah, that's all I'll add.
Yeah, very, very wise words. I think if you're talking down to someone, they may not appreciate that you're actually trying to help them, and they may not understand that. So it's a partnership and equal footing, I think is what Max said there. Any other questions anybody has, please?
Chair, I can see that our colleague James Bundy from the Freedom Declared Foundation has a question. Right. Is James able to get on the mic?
Yes. Well, thank you, Jim,
James.
and thank you, Max, Pablo, and Stephen, for your speeches and contributions to this discussion. As Dan said, I'm from Freedom Declared Foundation, which is a newish charity who's chaired by Dr. Nazir Ghania, and we work on defending and promoting Article 18 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, but we do it in an interfaith way. And it's building on the last question and the last answer in particular about what is the best way to promote understanding and then subsequently work between all the different faith groups when it comes to respecting and understanding religious minorities. And when we in the UK talk about religious minorities, there tends to be a focus about Christianity, but how do we get beyond that and talk about all faith groups and all religious minorities? Thank you.
Thanks very much, James. That's, who would like to perhaps answer that? Pablo?
I think that I have a good example about this. I think that when we talk about like in this forum, that I think that it's a very good idea to start the conversation. This is what we say in Mexico, and to talk about this subject. But at the same time, I think that we have to make, I mean, that in the example of Mexico, I was participating during 15 years in this like mercy ministry to arrive to this community that have this complication in the state of Chiapas. And I think that's something that we like, I'm realized 50 years later, it is like, it's not about to convince to the other that I'm the same that them. It's about to show that, yeah, I'm different than you, but that is not a problem. And so what does that mean with this? During 50 years, we visit every 6 months different communities that have problems with the different religion. And so what we doing, we arrive to these communities and we bring like doctors and we bring like materials for rebuild the skills or rebuild, I don't know, the government office. And so and we spend time with them. And so it's not about like I want to talk about my religion, as I want to show you, and because they speak different language, but I want to show you that yeah, we are different, but it's not bad. And so and we can fellowship and we can like work together. And so I mean, like in the practice is to give a new chance or new opportunities when the people can see, because I think that of something that is very natural for the men, it's like we feel fear about the different, we feel fear to the change. And I think that in this community that have like 100 years where they believe, or they have like centuries. And so it's like what it's in the practicity, like to create opportunities to doing things together and to work together. And so, and we see that our own faith like encourages to us to keep working and to keep doing these things all together.
Okay, thank you for that, Pablo. That was helpful. James, did that perhaps answer your thoughts or your question?
Yes. What Freedom Declared Foundation tried to do is promote the need to get understanding amongst faith groups about religious, theological positions, as well as understanding about religious minorities, and that not only is it Christians who are being persecuted for being religious minorities around the world, but all faiths somewhere in the world are being persecuted. So having that understanding and getting that understanding is what Freedom Declared Foundation is about. So any ideas that can be shared about that would be much appreciated and assist our work and hopefully assist your work as well.
Okay, James, thanks so much. I think one of the wonderful things of the APPG for freedom of religious belief that we have at Westminster, we have 130 or almost 140 members. They're all different faiths. There's Sikhs, there's Hindus, there's Jehovah's Witnesses. We have the Baha'i, the Christians with different denominations of Christians, but they all come together, I suppose, under the umbrella of those with Christian faith, those with other faith, and those with no faith, and we equally speak for each other. So I think you're absolutely right, James. That's one of the things that we should be trying to do. Padilla, please.
Thank you. If I may interject, because that was an important question that was asked. James asked about how interfaith community could assist this process. I just wanted to highlight that diversity of actions are important, and bearing in mind that different organizations may have different approaches. And we need to think creatively as we can see the situation of human rights around the world deteriorate. But bringing back to the point that Pablo and Max introduced, is that these communities want to have partnership. They don't want people to speak on their behalf. And I know from our experience in the Baha'i office, we, even in the case of the Baha'i community, we will not highlight their case until the community in the respective country has been consulted. That's why this produces some barriers when we take this approach to just go ahead and partner with other organizations. Hence, the Baha'i community has found other ways, like the Baha'i international community is very active in Geneva. Minorities may not know the systems, the mechanisms of the United Nations, and this being their fellowship, assisting them to learn about these mechanisms is one thing that we can do. The processes that mentioned documentation to assist with that is another way of doing. So it's not just one approach for all the problems, just bearing in mind that the fellowship is there and the communities will assist in whatever way they seem appropriate and commiserate with their resources, of course.
Okay, but thank you very much. That's very helpful. Any other questions?
I believe Nabil Rastani from Dodds may also have a question. I don't know if Nabil's able to get on the...
Yes, hello.
Nabil, please. Thank you, Nell.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I just had a quick question regarding kind of from a policy perspective, what kind of new initiatives could be introduced to perhaps maybe alleviate the suffering of these communities around the world?
Max?
Yeah, sure.
Please.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so for example, when I was talking about Iraq, as we know, the US and the UK are partners with the state. So they're allies, they're part of the coalition together to defeat ISIS and so on. When you consider the US as well, the US give hundreds of millions of dollars to the Kurdistan regional government. They pay salaries, they do so on and so forth. The country itself is hugely steeped in Western support and solidarity regarding the crimes that have been committed by ISIS. Now, given all of that support, given these partnerships that exist on a state-to-state level, what we've seen is that there are no real conditionalities placed on that support with regards to minority rights, land theft, and their condition in the country. And those are things that have been missing since 2003. And that is something that can definitely be, adjusted. That is a very real policy conversation that can be had. And the leverage is there. It's already there. It doesn't even need to be developed. It's just about making the case and making that part of the agenda. And like I said, many states in the West have this leverage in Iraq. They just choose not to exercise it.
Okay, Max, thank you. And you're right, that's a settled theme for us at Westminster as well, I believe, when it comes to human rights and when it comes to aid, that we do feel, many of us feel, I'm not quite sure if government has grasped it yet, although they do say that it becomes a regular conversational piece, and perhaps more than a conversational piece, I would hope, whenever they're discussing anything. And I think government means that, honestly, and I think it's truthful as well, that they do bring human rights issues to the fore wherever they're highlighted, and the government's much more proactive now than what they were. Any other questions anybody has, please? Yes, Stephen, thank you.
I was just going to maybe add a bit to that. I mean, obviously, and it builds on the point Max was making, obviously, that there are other global dynamics at play with regards particularly to Iran, and I alluded to some of the difficulties in engaging with the Iranian authorities and drawing them into conversations. But of course, there are ongoing negotiations and diplomatic moves to try and engage Iran in relation to its nuclear program. And it very much seems to me that human rights should also be introduced into the dialogue when those kind of agreements and those kind of arrangements are being forged and taken forward. And in addition to that, from a policy perspective, I kind of alluded to it when I was speaking earlier as well, that Iran doesn't necessarily adhere to or feel bound by international human rights treaties and international provisions in relation to human rights. It seems to me that one thing from a policy perspective that all states can be doing and governments can be pushing is greater engagement by all states with international treaties in relation to human rights, by themselves adhering to the international rule of law and promoting the international rule of law, and using that as leverage to push and encourage other states to follow and to do the same, and by signing up to agreements such as the Rome Statute on the International Criminal Court. I noticed that one of the questions that Dan asked is in the chat is what land rights, when land rights have been denied by national judicial processes, what options for justice are there from international institutions and mechanisms? And one very interesting development at the International Criminal Court is the way that land rights and displaced people and those kind of cases can be brought within the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. One of the deficiencies or problems with the International Criminal Court is that it only has jurisdiction over states that have signed up and ratified the Rome Statute. States that are not parties don't come within its jurisdiction. But there's been some movement on that, in particular in relation to groups that have been deported and are subject to deportation from countries. And a good example is the Rohingya in Myanmar. Myanmar is not a party to the Rome Statute, but its neighbour Bangladesh is. And the International Criminal Court has held that it can have jurisdiction over crimes committed by Myanmar in relation to the Rohingya, because they've been deported and displaced from their land from Myanmar into Bangladesh, which they say is a transnational crime, and therefore because Bangladesh is a party to the Rome Statute, the International Criminal Court can exercise jurisdiction. So one thing that I think is very important to look at in relation to, particularly in relation to land rights, is the effect that the displacement has had on people. If they had been moved from countries which are not, for example, subject to the International Criminal Court, to countries which are signed up to the International Criminal Court, that may be a way in for such international institutions to have jurisdiction and leverage.
Okay, Stephen, thank you very much. I think that answer has been extremely helpful. For those of us who are not legally minded, it might be good to have maybe a couple of pages in that there to give us some idea, just so I can personally understand it better, and then be able to do something. Any other questions anybody has? If Dan, do you want to say a few last words?
I think I'll pass actually to Padre to say a final thank you, but our thanks and muchas gracias también Pablo por tiempo. But I think Padre may have a final thanks, and our thanks also, of course, to you.
Okay, Padre, over to you, please. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Jim, and all our distinguished panelists for taking the time to be with us. As we mentioned at the beginning of our gathering, there are certain issues that may not come under the scrutiny of the international community because they may not seem or grab the headlines. So we are grateful to individuals who've taken the time to be here, and to Jim, as ever, who's really a force. With his energy, he really pushes forward the agenda of freedom of religion or belief. And your presence and your advocacy is much appreciated, and it's not taken for granted. Thank you so much, all. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you very much. Can I just say a big thank you to obviously to Padilla, but to Dan as well, and to Carmel there, to our three speakers, to Max, Pablo, and Stephen. Incredible experience and knowledge which we can all benefit from. I'm presuming that we'll maybe do a wee summary perhaps, Padilla, of the meeting today, and if we are, maybe we can send that out to each other as not just as a chair of the APPG of Freedom of Religious Belief, but also as a member of Parliament here at Westminster. I'm at your disposal to help whenever you can. If there's things you want me to do, it's only a matter of asking. I'm incredibly privileged to be able to chair this today. Although for one stage I lost you. I could hear you, but I just couldn't see you. Unfortunately, is where I was wrong. So again, thank you so much, and keep safe, take care, and
Thank
God bless, and thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you.
Thank you.